Twilight Princess is my favorite mainline Zelda game. It took everything that we loved from the rest of the games in the series and combined them all together to give us what I think, in my opinion, is the pinnacle of classic Zelda design. In this video, I want to talk about my favorite elements from this game, that being the story, the dungeon design, and the item-based progression. Something that I feel has been integral to the series, but something that I also feel has been lacking in the newer open-world Zelda games. I also want to conclude with where the games are now and kind of speculate what's next for Zelda. Now, we know it's most likely going to be another open-world game, and I think it'd be fun to talk about where they could take the new formula, or if they could implement the old formula, and what I'd like to see from what's next in open-air Zelda. Twilight Princess released all the way back in 2006. Fun fact, I did not know that it released on Wii first. The version that I played back then was on GameCube. While some people, including myself, absolutely loved it, I ended up playing through it like 8 times back then. A lot of people were kind of mixed on it, saying it was too similar to Ocarina of Time, and the art style just didn't hold up compared to the Wind Waker. But in more recent years, there's kind of been a shift. More and more people are finally acknowledging this game. I've even heard it called the definitive sequel to Ocarina of Time. You can say it's the Zelda cycle or whatever else you want to call it, but for me, I've never been happier to see in comment sections so many fans of Twilight Princess, because my stance has never changed. This has always been my favorite mainline Zelda game, even during my honeymoon phase with Breath of the Wild when I clocked in over 300 hours during my first playthrough. There's just always been this void that no other Zelda game could fill for me. The one thing that has always kept me coming back to this game is its more focused and linear experience. This led to the most imaginative dungeon design that we've seen in a series. I can't believe that this game isn't on Nintendo Switch yet. I mean, seriously. But on the other hand, I don't know if I'd want them to remaster this game. With the way companies have been with censoring out the most harmless things in recent years, like, oh my god guys, we can't have women like Telma showing cleavage, and we gotta tweak this dialogue. Like, all that washing away anything that could remotely be taken as offensive down to the micro level just makes media boring. Anyways, back on topic, I played through this game again on Steam Deck, and I'm happy to report that the magic that captured me as a teenager it's still here. In fact, I've grown to appreciate Twilight Princess more for its story this time around. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to say that the story is deeper than you remember or anything like that. On its surface, I can see how it can come off as like just a rehash of Ocarina of Time. In the beginning, Link's life in Ordon Village is suspiciously similar to his life in Kokiri Forest. I mean, the first 3 dungeons are forest, fire, and water in that exact order. The fused shadows are basically the Spirit Stones, and Ganon is trying to take over Hyrule in exactly the same way. It's the layers in between where Twilight Princess shines. The world building and character development, alongside an outstanding level of presentation, makes it the most endearing Zelda story yet. Sure, I love how Groose in Skyward Sword goes from a pompous jerk to an absolute Chad by the end, but when I think of the people of Ordon Village living out their simple lives, the children, Telma and her hole-in-the-wall bar, Kakariko, Renato still sheltering the children despite having their entire village massacred during the raid with the shadow beasts and left with limited resources, Twilight Princess just makes me feel like Hyrule is a kingdom worth fighting for. The cutscenes are cinematic and the action set pieces are bombastic. This game knows when to slow down and let its world and characters build, and before you get the chance to become bored, it introduces conflict. For example, when we fail to enter the Goron mines because of the Goron blocking the path, Renato mentions he's friends with Mayor Bo of Ordon. We then have to backtrack, and the mayor teaches us the art of sumo wrestling and gives us a pair of iron boots, what he secretly used to defeat the Goron Patriarch in a wrestling match. It's what we need to get past the hostile Goron blocking the entrance to the Goron mines. When we return though, King Bulblin and his goons show up and kidnap Colin, leading to that epic battle on that bridge that we all remember. It's this constant balancing act that keeps you engaged with the narrative. Twilight Princess also delivered on telling a more darker and mature story. This game seriously creeps me out at times. It's crazy to think that this was the first Zelda game to have ever gotten a T rating. I mean, I just went from Link herding goats in his dirty farmer clothes and hanging out with children to Link having his head bashed in and his girlfriend getting shot in the back. They're out here kidnapping kids, man. Seeing Zelda in the Kingdom of Hyrule absolutely helpless to stop Zant from engulfing the world in Twilight, Link being snatched up and turned into a wolf, seeing the citizens unknowingly living as spirits, it was clear that Nintendo was taking the goo goo gaga gloves off with this one. One thing that I didn't like in Breath of the Wild is kinda how it felt like Link didn't have a personal stake in the story. I know he's a silent protagonist, but in Twilight Princess, you could feel Link's determination to save his friends and how genuinely happy he is when they're finally reunited. The village kids as a supporting cast makes Link feel like a cool older brother. I really miss when Link had a personality, like in Ocarina of Time, Link having nightmares, expressing shock and joy, him being scared by the Zora Princess's crush on him. In The Wind Waker, he's a lazy, carefree kid that becomes an optimistic hero. In Breath of the Wild, he's an amnesiac goldfish. But no reincarnation of Link would be anything without a strong sidekick character. And I think Midna is the reason sidekicks need to come back to Zelda. Sure, Navi and Fi are annoying, interrupting us every 5 seconds to remind us of the obvious, but at least we had someone to keep us company. But Midna, she's so much more than that. She makes you want to keep playing to see how her character arc unfolds. In the beginning, she's selfish and manipulates Link into getting what she wants, acting as if he's nothing more than a servant. But as the story progresses, you start to see her warm up to Link and start to sympathize with the Kingdom of Hyrule. Unlike in the beginning, when she only really cared about her own problems. The writers really get you invested into her character. That's why when Zant shows up and traps us in our wolf form and Midna gets flash bombed by Linnayru's light, one of the most emotional set pieces that I've ever experienced in a game happens. Midna is forced out of the Twilight and she's basically like a fish out of water. You have to carry her back to the castle in hopes that Zelda can save her and break the curse on Link, and she's just on the verge of death, and the whole time this music's playing. It seriously hits me every time. And when Zelda sacrifices herself to save Midna, it makes you truly realize the destructive power of Zant. And then they end up pushing him aside just to shoehorn in Ganondorf for the sake of nostalgia, and oh hey, look, it's Zelda! She's alive! Making her sacrifice to Midna mean absolutely nothing. Now, I could be cliche and say, it's not about the destination, guys. It's about the journey along the way. But I have to side with fans on this one. It makes what could have been the greatest story in the series feel like pandering fan service by the end. Well, at least we got to see Midna's transformation at the end, though. One thing the Zelda community likes to bring up, being the reason this game is one of the weaker titles in the series, is just how slow this game feels to start. I'm gonna be completely honest. It never bothered me. In fact, every time I replay Twilight Princess, I feel like I grow a deeper appreciation for its intro sequence. Hanging out with the kids, speaking with the villagers, just soaking in all the atmosphere. I almost don't want to leave by the time the adventure begins. That being said, I can't lie though and say that the complaints aren't valid. I'm willing to accept that I might just be nostalgia blind. I pretty much know this game like the back of my hand, and during this most recent playthrough, it took me like 4 hours before I stepped foot in Hyrule Field. Is it doing stupid little fetch quests and herding goats for 4 hours straight like people want you to believe? No. I mean, within that time, you've already gone through the entire gameplay loop from Wolf Link in the Light Vessel sections to even completing your first dungeon and adding an item to your tool belt. In my opinion, Twilight Princess needed this section to build the story and make it as strong as it was. I know with recent games like Starfield, it's become kind of a meme, the whole, just wait, it gets better. People just kind of roll their eyes, but I truly do believe Twilight Princess is one of those games where a little bit of patience goes a long way. But what if I told you, though, that the story isn't what made Twilight Princess memorable? The more mature themes that the game uses, even Wolf Link, is not the reason this game stands out. I feel like each Zelda game has that one standout feature. Ocarina of Time had you becoming adult Link. Majora's Mask had its weird time limit mechanic. The Wind Waker is memorable because it had you sailing the open seas. It's pretty much the first open world Zelda game. Well, Twilight Princess has that too. What makes this game memorable, for me and a lot of fans, is the fact that this might just have the best dungeons in the series. Playing through the Forest Temple reminded me of how much dungeons used to be a focus back then. Being dropped into one big puzzle box and having to slowly peel back the layers, finding keys, maps, compasses, and those sweet, sweet tool items. They were just such a joy. The gimmick of finding and rescuing these trapped monkeys in order to progress further into the dungeon makes this one of the most memorable trials in all of Zelda. Watching them gather together to help you swing across gaps felt charming and lighthearted. The tool you find is the Galewind Boomerang, the same one that this asshole used to destroy the bridge we needed to cross. You obtain it after repeatedly smacking the cheeks off this guy, and my 4-year-old daughter was cracking up the whole time watching Link wail on the monkey's butt. After he's defeated, you learn he's not actually evil, but was being controlled by this parasite. The Galewind Boomerang is used in a lot of interesting ways. It even locks onto multiple targets like in the Wind Waker, rotating these bridges, pulling up the floor tile monsters, grabbing up these bug bombs and transporting them to blow up out of reach walls. This is the type of utility item I wish could return to the more modern style of games. At the end of this trial, you gather up all the monkeys and they form this giant rope in order to swing you across this chasm to the boss door on the other side, and this is one of those moments I look back on fondly whenever I think of my 10 years away from this game. And just like any good Zelda dungeon, the boss at the end is a test of everything you've learned from using your new tool. The boss monkey that we freed from the parasite shows up and returns the favor by ziplining back and forth and giving us bombs for our boomerang to damage the boss. See, he was a good guy all along. The second dungeon, though, the Goron Mines, is probably my least favorite. It's not a bad dungeon, it just had to be the one centered around the Iron Boots, and just like Ocarina of Time, they slow the gameplay down to a snail's pace. Sure, walking along the ceilings on these magnetic surfaces is cool as hell, but anytime you need to do it more than once, it's pretty tedious. Other than that, the giant armored Goron that you have to fight on that magnetic arena teetering over that pit of lava, it felt like the final sumo wrestling fight. It was pretty badass when you think of it. I mean, Link started out by stopping a goat from escaping Ordon Village in this way. So, going from that to this, pretty badass. And fighting that corrupted Goron engulfed in flames at the end had me at the edge of my seat. Until I remembered that the solution to beating him was just shooting his eye and tripping him up a few times. Even though he was cool, I'll admit that fight being piss baby easy kind of felt disappointing. By this point, we have the boomerang, iron boots, bombs, a bow. I miss the feeling of slowly building up Link's arsenal with his Batman-like utility belt. And I compare it to Batman because he doesn't have superpowers. Other than his birthright to wield the Master Sword, Link is kind of a regular dude. His claw shot is like Batman's grapple hook. I really think Tears of the Kingdom disregarded this in favor of what's essentially cheat codes. As much as I love Ascend and Ultra Hand, I feel like the level design had to suffer because of it. It ends up feeling like they were made by a modding community instead of a studio full of highly experienced video game developers. When it comes to my favorite dungeons in Twilight Princess, I get stuck between Lakebed Temple and Snow Peak. On one hand, I feel like Lakebed Temple is one of the best in terms of design, having this big rotating central room that directs water throughout the dungeon is genius, and I'm a sucker when it comes to underwater traversal in games. On the other hand, Snow Peak is so unique as a dungeon, it doesn't even feel like one. I mean, it's pretty linear compared to other dungeons, but the atmosphere and the story it tells with Yeto and his sick wife is absolutely heartwarming. Also, how badass is it being able to swing around this massive ball and chain? When it comes to ice-themed dungeons, this is my favorite in the series. And sometimes my favorite dungeon changes during a new playthrough. The Arbiter Grounds? I mean, you get to ride on what is essentially a Beyblade, and the fight against Star-Lord is the gold standard for bosses in Zelda games. The City in the Sky has my favorite item in the entire series, the double claw shot. I mean, it wins by a landslide. But I'd have to make a ranking on all 9 of these dungeons, and even that would be hard to jam in a single video. So to keep this video from becoming a lengthy retrospective, I want to kind of wind down and discuss the future of Zelda. Now, I think that we can all agree that both fans of classic Zelda and open-air Zelda don't want to see an excessive amount of shrines in Korok's Return. Hell, I don't even think Nintendo themselves want to triple down on those. But that begs the question, what exactly would they fill the world with when we're so used to those being major parts of progression, upgrading hearts, stamina, and inventory slots? Well, what I could see them doing is going back to heart pieces. Now, in order to do that, I could easily see them turning into needles in haystacks. What I'd like them to do is maybe have NPCs mark your map with interesting locations that could possibly lead to heart pieces or permanent stamina upgrades. Maybe there's a cartographer that can sell you maps, or just stumbling upon them randomly out in the wild like before. I think it's way more exciting when you don't know what you're going to get. A huge part of what made Breath of the Wild stand out was its exploration, but in a third installment, we're already too used to shrines. They aren't exciting anymore to find off in the distance because most of the time, all of the time, they have the same reward. But if they do have shrines return, I'd like to see them cut the number of shrines in half, as well as make the shrines biome specific. An example would be if you find a shrine in a jungle biome, that shrine would reflect it aesthetically. Snowy biomes would have ice puzzles, so on and so on. I would also like shrines to have difficulty progression. I think you could easily do this by adding things like time limits and more difficult enemies based on how far you are in the game. One thing that myself and a lot of others didn't like is the weapon durability system, and how Tears of the Kingdom felt like a band-aid on an already existing problem. So many other games have already done weapon durability better, and it's just as simple as copying from them. Literally, as soon as your weapon durability reaches 0, have that weapon do less damage until we can take it to a blacksmith to get it repaired. Don't just take it away from us. I feel like this was such a dumb idea, and I hoped it wouldn't transfer over to Tears of the Kingdom, but it did, and like I said, it's just a band-aid. It doesn't actually fix the problem. I feel like Breath of the Wild had the best combat in the series, having a super tight shield parry and being able to pull off Fury Rushes, even though the dodge window for it was kind of lenient. It was still awesome as hell. The only thing, though, is brought down by the fact that the game doesn't incentivize you to even be in combat because you don't want to break your weapons. Even when you are in combat, there's absolutely no skill required because you can just open up your inventory and pull from Skyrim's playbook of eat your way through every single punch. What would make more sense, and I can definitely see the developers doing this, is just bringing back limited bottles. Now, you could still have the cooking system. It would grant you your buffs like defense and attack power, yada yada, but health restoration would be limited to bottles, kind of like how Estus flasks work in Dark Souls. This would actually incentivize you to use recipes more because certain buffs like defense go farther knowing that you only have limited health. But the biggest problem, and this is one that they have to deal with, is the traversal system. The ability to climb on nearly every surface was already overpowered. The fact that we can basically build all these contraptions and flying machines to go everywhere is absolutely broken. There's no reason to even ride on horses anymore, and one of the most immersive things in Breath of the Wild was riding horseback through Hyrule's fields. I'm absolutely positive that in the next game they at least take a more subtle approach to the abilities, if not get rid of them entirely in favor of the item-based progression of the past. Now, I can see a lot of people thinking that that'd just be impossible for them to bring back. I mean, you'd have to be able to do dungeons in any order, and my answer to that is, why wouldn't you be able to? I don't see why you couldn't, say, craft a claw shot from a blueprint using resources you gather. Maybe that dungeon's entrance has a high wall that you can't reach and you need something like a claw shot. I also think that it would work in the overworld as well because you could easily get yourself a head start on a mountainside before having to climb the rest of the way using your stamina. You could use it to clear huge gaps and, like I mentioned before, get to areas you can't climb to. An item like a lantern could be used to light up pitch black caves while freeing up both hands to use for weapons. These are perfectly fine utility items that wouldn't become pointless outside of a dungeon like in past games. I personally want to see us be able to dive underwater again. Just think of all the cool shit you could hide under there, like treasures and even a whole ass dungeon like the Lake Bed Temple in Twilight Princess. Or how about this? You need an item to progress through a dungeon? Well, the biome that the dungeon is in has shrines dotted around it, just like in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. But what if the area you complete the shrines in end with a treasure chest that has a 25% chance to contain the tool you need? If you don't get it, then the next shrine you find has a 50% chance to contain the tool you need, gradually building until you're guaranteed to find the item you need to progress while still being relatively close to the dungeon you needed it for. It takes out all the tedious backtracking and organically feeds into exploration. So the story in Breath of the Wild, it was okay. The memories, they didn't bother me because they all seemed kind of self-contained. But in Tears of the Kingdom, for me, the story was literally all over the place. Now, I've heard that if you're paying real close attention, you can find out how to see the story in the correct order. But the fact that you can even accidentally ruin the story for yourself is just bad to me. They should have just had the cutscenes play out in order no matter which one you find. Also, the ancient sages are boring. They repeat the same exact lines every time. Overall, there's just no reason for me to feel invested in any way. I hope that in the third game they stick to a more linear story, but I really hope they find a way to have it take place in the present day. I feel like they tried to tell a more complex story, but they just used the framework of Breath of the Wild to tell it. And Tears of the Kingdom, it just doesn't work. But that's about it. I want to know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think that they can find new and interesting ways to use the same open air elements a third time? Or do you think we're going to see some more classic elements get injected into the third game? Or are they just going to pivot and do something new entirely? Also, in my last video, I seen a lot of Twilight Princess fans in the comments. What would you want to see from a Switch version of this game? Would you be happy if we just got the Wii U version ported, or do you think we deserve the Metroid Prime treatment? As always, thank you for watching, and if you guys like this content, I wouldn't mind making more Zelda-related videos, whether it be rankings, retrospectives, or just plain old video game analysis.